Today we're doing a deep dive into the Honolulu J2K and J2K Pro 14mm paddles. How do they stack up to the 16mm versions? Well, without further ado, let's dink straight into it. The Honolulu J2K 14mm comes in at a price of $155, and you can take 20 bucks off using code STSPickleball at checkout, making it just 135 bucks. The Pro version, which has the tighter weave on the surface of the face, comes in at $165, and the same code STSPickleball also gets you 20 bucks off, making it $145. Honestly, 135 bucks for the quality being delivered here is just outstanding. Honolulu just doesn't seem to miss. The construction is super premium, the grip feels wonderful in the hand, it's a solid one-piece grip so there aren't any weird edges that you feel underneath the grip tape, which for me is a huge red flag with other paddles. I won't name any names, but whenever I pick up a paddle that has a funky grip, I just set it back down as I would rather not even use it. It's hard to put the 14mm J2K down. Every time I play with it, I just want to keep playing one more game and one more game, which is the best thing that can happen with a new paddle. Both of these paddles are utilizing 100% DuPont Kevlar as their surface material on the face of the paddles. The J2K is their traditional Kevlar weave, and the J2K Pro is a tighter weave of 100% Kevlar, which results in more power and pop off the face. If you like more of a plush feel off the face, I would grab the J2K, and if you like more of a rigid and firmer feel off the face, I would grab the J2K Pro. The main differences between the 14mm versions and the 16mm versions are the pop and the sweet spot. We'll get into some of the tangible metrics and ratings soon, but overall, the 14mm versions certainly have more pop than their 16mm counterparts, noticeably more pop. So if you love your J2K and find yourself wanting a bit more aggression on your counters and hand volley battles at the kitchen line, the 14mm might just be your answer. The extra pop does come at the loss of sweet spot though. As with any paddle, when you get more of one thing, you tend to lose some of another. And in this case, more pop and faster hand speed comes at the cost of a tighter sweet spot and a bit harsher feeling around the edge of the paddle face. Keep in mind, extra pop also does take away from controllability of the paddle as well. These are certainly things you need to take into consideration when choosing your next paddle or analyzing what might benefit your game the most. I did have some third shot and fifth shot drops and also some dinks that I had to run in and reach for that I popped up a bit higher than I would have with the 16mm versions. But to counter that point, I also had some hand volley battles and some putaways that I won quicker than I would have with the 16mm versions. If you can hit the sweet spot while in a hand volley battle with the 14mm J2K, your opponent is going to have a very hard time keeping up with how fast the ball is coming back at them in comparison to the 16mm versions. And the same thing goes for speed ups at the net. When I conceal a speed up and act like I'm going to dink the ball and then quickly flick my wrist to speed up the ball is definitely coming off at a more aggressive pace than if I had done the same speed up with the 16mm versions. So again, to condense this all, the 14mm J2Ks have a tighter sweet spot and less control, but they have more pop and feel a bit more agile in the hand for faster hand speed at the net. So if you tend to hit the sweet spot pretty regularly and have a good sense of control in your game and just need that extra aggression on speed ups and hand volleys, the 14mm versions might suit your game incredibly well. Let's throw up some metrics here. So of course they're 14mm in thickness. They're a hybrid shape coming in at less than 16.5 inches in length, which would be the length of an elongated paddle. So the J2K comes in at 16.2 inches in length, which is what objectively categorizes it as a hybrid paddle. The grip lengths are 5.5 inches and the grip circumferences are 4.125 inches, which is my personal favorite circumference. I always say you can add more tape, but you just can't take away from the stock circumference, so it's nice that these come in at 4.125 inches. The swing weight for the J2K 14mm is 115.98, and the swing weight for the J2K Pro 14mm is 113.43, which is interesting because usually a higher swing weight will equal more power as it has more weight towards the head of the paddle, increasing its power and plow through. But the takeaway here is that the J2K Pro is actually getting its extra power and pop from the tighter weave on the face. Twist weight wise, the J2K 14mm comes in at a whopping 6.84 and the J2K Pro comes in at 6.73, which are incredible numbers for 14mm paddles. These have the best stock twist weight of any 14mm paddle I have ever tested, and it really goes to show that they are trying to push the boundaries and really make sure every detail is perfected at Honolulu Pickleball, which is something I really love to see. I remember my first phone call with the owner and he just seemed extremely energetic and passionate passionate about his craft. Alright, let's jump into the spin results. The spin for the 14mm J2K comes in at 2160 RPM, and the spin for the 14mm J2K Pro comes in at 2124 RPM. Comparing these results to their 16mm counterparts, we have the original J2K 16mm at 2232 RPM, and the original J2K Pro 16mm at 2184 RPM. I find it interesting that the spin is a bit lower, but I have to say my original J2K 16mm had some insanity grit on the face of those paddles. It seems they dialed it back just a touch, and rightfully so after all the issues YOLO had with their production models. I think some of these companies are really wanting to make sure that they are within the legal boundaries for tournament play, but generally speaking, the same paddle will tend to get more spin at 14mm and a bit less spin at 16mm in comparison. So this was interesting to see. As far as durability goes, my original 16mm versions of these paddles have only lost 286 RPM of spin over 3 months of solid play, which is really good and on par with some of the most premium paddles in the space. So I can certainly vouch for the durability of these paddles and the longevity of spin you should get with them. What I will say is that these are the best 14mm paddles I have ever played with, and the dip you get over the net is just awesome to see. Power and pop wise, the J2K and J2K Pro 14mm paddles are top tier in the 14mm category. Like I said earlier, the aggression you get on speed ups and in hand battles at the net is far more intense than their 16mm counterparts. It's not a subtle difference either. It's something you will certainly notice in play. So the J2K 14mm comes in at an 8.9 out of 10 for power and an 8.8 out of 10 for pop. And the J2K Pro 14mm comes in at a 9.2 for power and a 9.2 for pop. Comparing this to their 16mm counterparts, we have the 16mm J2K at 9.2 out of 10 for power and an 8.4 for pop, and the 16mm J2K Pro at a 9.6 for power and a 9 for pop. So we can see that the 14mm versions have less power and pop as we had expected. Also, I want to note that as I go into my database and things change and I review new paddles, you may see some numbers change as well. I am always trying to make sure I adjust numbers to fit the current landscape of paddles so that you can wrap your head around what something feels like in comparison to a paddle you might already have or in comparison to another paddle you might be interested in. So make sure to keep an eye on the database if you're analyzing paddles. I always have the link for that in the description down below. Sweet spot wise, the 14mm versions do have objectively smaller sweet spots than the 16mm versions. We have the 14mm J2K at an 8.9 out of 10 and the 14mm J2K Pro at an 8.7 out of 10. Still really solid, especially for 14mm paddles. These have some of the best sweet spots of any 14mm paddle I have ever tried of relative shape. Comparing these numbers to the 16mm versions, we have the original 16mm J2K at a 9.3 and the 16mm J2K Pro at a solid 9 out of 10. Honolulu Pickleball really dialed in their internal perimeter weighting, and with that high stock twist weight for a 14mm paddle, you will certainly notice these have a wonderful sweet spot for their respective thickness. So props to Honolulu again in this category. Control wise again, like we talked about before, we will see a bit of a dip in comparison to the 16mm versions. This comes at the cost of better pop and a bit more maneuverability. So the 14mm J2K comes in at an 8.7 and the 14mm J2K Pro comes in at an 8.4 out of 10 for control. Let's load up the ratings for the 16mm J2K and J2K Pro at 9.2 and 8.9 respectively. And we can see that the 14mm versions do in fact have a bit less control than the 16mm versions. They aren't uncontrollable, but if you do get a bit wristy and you're running in and trying to softly get a ball over the net while in movement, it does make it a bit more difficult to control the trajectory and power you're putting into that shot. But again, the trade-off is that you get more aggression at the net and more put-away power overall to end points quicker. Overall, I have to say these are the best 14mm hybrid paddles I have ever used. I think with their optimized twist weight and respectable swing weight, these paddles fit in the marketplace extremely well and are absolutely top tier. Easily taking the current 14mm hybrid crown out of every paddle I have ever tested. If you want to see my top 5 paddles so far in 2024, click here. Have a freaking wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.